When an offense has different criminal intents, I just touched on this at the end of the last slide when we were going through the states of mind. I presented the burglary in the third, the charge, that's the charge in New York State. I want to revisit that because it actually had to. So let's work through this. Burglary in the third degree is a person is guilty of burglary in the third degree when he knowingly enters or remains unlawfully in a building with intent to commit a crime therein. So we know that each crime has at least three elements: the criminal act, the criminal intent, and then a concurrence, which we'll talk about momentarily. That'll be the next video, how they work together. But sometimes each element has its own state of mind or intent. And in here we have that. So here we got like two acts and we have two intents. And sometimes there's more. There are statutes where there's more. And when we get into talking about the specific types of offenses, we'll see this expand a little bit more. But let's use burglary. It's nice and simple. So if somebody knowingly enters, and I used my shed, if you knowingly came to my house and entered and stayed in my shed unlawfully, and nothing else happens, you won't be charged with burglary. You might be charged with something else if there is a trespass type of charge in a state. In New York State there is, which basically says if you knowingly enter and remain unlawfully in a building, you can be charged with criminal trespass. You don't have to do anything. You just don't have permission to be there. So for it to, and that's a misdemeanor offense. Burglary third is a felony, I will tell you, in New York State. So as you can see, this charge will heighten, become a felony. The culpability raises when you add the second component, which is yet another act and another state of mind. And that is with the intent to commit a crime therein. If we're going to use the model penal code word, they will say purposely, to purposely commit a crime therein. And that crime could be anything. Most of the time it's theft. It could be, if it's a store, it could be starting as a theft, but maybe there is a female clerk and you're going to hold it up and it's a male defendant and the male defendant decides to sexually assault her. That's another crime in and of itself. So the intent could be to steal, to commit a rape, to beat somebody up, as long as there's an intent to commit a crime when they knowingly enter and remain in a building. I will tell you, since we are on burglary, the next level up for burglary in the second degree, which brings us to a higher level of culpability, would be if building was a dwelling. So that's where we get to the breaking and entering into somebody's home. But we'll talk more about burglary a little later. But what I want to jump into is the exceptions to criminal intent. We had a slight exception to the act. It had to be voluntary. And if it wasn't voluntary, then you don't have an act. But criminal intent, while 99% of the time you need some sort of level of intent, we do have laws where there's no state of mind. There's some instances where the defendant's state of mind is not necessary for the district attorney to prove. And we call that strict liability. That's behavior is criminal when the defendant commits an act without having a state of mind, like purposefully, knowingly, willfully, negligently, recklessly. We don't have any of that. So let me give you a couple of examples. Statutory rape. You don't need the defendant's intent. All you need is a young minor, male or female, minor. Well, in New York State, it's 17, so 17 and younger. The 21-year-old meets a 16-year-old out, even if the 16-year-old says, I'm 20. If that's not the kid saying, I didn't know how old he or she was, or they told me they were of age, doesn't matter if the district attorney can prove that you've had sexual relationship with, if that 21-year-old had a sexual relationship with the minor and the minor's age, it doesn't matter what the intent was. It's a strict liability. Other types of charges that are strict liability: speeding. When you get pulled over for speeding, your defense can be, well, I didn't know I wasn't speeding. It's if the speed limit is 65 on the highway and you're going 80, then you're speeding. There is no, oh, my speedometer is broke. That's not a defense either. If you have been, usually by radar, if it's deemed you're speeding, you're speeding. Why do we have these kinds of things? Failing to pay your taxes. You don't pay your taxes, it doesn't matter what your intent is. You could be charged with a crime for not paying taxes. So these kinds of laws, these strict liability offenses, are here for public safety, health, welfare. The tax example, well, the government wants their money, right? So strict liability is one of those cases where criminal intent is not necessary. And just to finish my strict liability, in New York, here's the statutory rape statute. I should have clicked to it when I was talking about it, but this is what it says: when a person engages in sexual intercourse with another person who is incapable of consent by the reason that they're less than 17 years old, and being 21 years old or more, and he or she engages in a sexual intercourse with another person less than 17. So we do have our, actually the being 21 years old and more, he or she engaged in sexual intercourse with another one, that's actually a lower level offense. They did degrade the age, probably because most of the time we're talking about a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship when you have that very small number in between the ages. So that's a lower level offense, but it is strict liability nonetheless. So oh yeah. So Peter Pumpkin. I'm going to start with my example instead of my law, I guess. Peter Pumpkin admits he pulled the trigger intentionally, intending the conduct, but responds that he's not guilty of killing somebody because he did not intend to hit Lucy, but rather intended to hit Mark, who was trying to assault him. So he pulls the trigger. He says he pulls the trigger. Lucy gets shot, but his argument is, I didn't intend, he meant to shoot Mark and hits Lucy instead, but I rather intended to hit Mark because he was trying to attack me. So we have Mark attacking Peter Pumpkin. Peter Pumpkin's got a gun. He goes to shoot Mark, misses, and hits Lucy. Can he be charged with a crime? I didn't intend to shoot you and I miss and hit you. Is that a defense? Probably not, because we have this law called transferred intent. And the intent is transferred from the intended victim, in that particular instance, Mark, to the actual injured victim, who is Lucy. Even if Lucy didn't die, let's say she just got shot, but she lived, could he be charged with something like assault on Lucy? Sure. So the intent, even though he didn't intend to hit Lucy and intended to hit somebody else, that intent will transfer to the other victim. This only works when we're dealing with a bad result or a victim's crime. And a person, there's a person that is hurt. So let's look at an example. So Mary throws a stone at Jim and hits Jim. Do we have a crime? Yeah, some version of assault. She threw a stone at Jim and it hits him. Can she be held liable for intentionally hitting John? Yes. So Mary throws a stone at Jim, but misses and breaks the plate glass window behind him. Can Mary be held liable for intentionally breaking the plate glass window? If you're thinking about, oh, well, transferred intent. She tried, her intent was to hit Jim, but she missed and she broke the window. She should be liable. She should be charged. But that's not how transferred intent works. This is where that little exception that it only applies to the victim, a person victim. The window is not going to count. That intent isn't going to transfer. Will Mary be responsible for the window? Sure, she's going to have to pay for it. Whoever owns the window can sue her in civil case, but she can't be arrested because she didn't have the intent to break the window. Now, if she picked up the rock because Jim was standing on the other side of the window and chucked it in, she can't say, well, I didn't mean to break the window, I meant to hit Jim. She meant to break the window. So that's how transfer intent works. It has to be bad result, victim's crime. And this is the criminal mischief fourth statute in New York. Intentionally damage another's property, or you can recklessly damage another's property, but we don't have the intent that transfers from the potential assault on a person to a broken window. And one final exception to this criminal intent element is concept called vicarious liability. This is where a defendant can be responsible for someone else's conduct. What happens here is there's a transfer of defendant's liability for a crime to a different defendant, or in addition to. The defendant doesn't actually have to be the one to commit the act, just needs to be involved with the actual actor. But the key point here is there needs to be a relationship between the two people. Is there something that might jump out at you, a relationship where this might come in? If you're thinking parent-child, do you think a parent is responsible for their child's crimes? You think about that for a second. If you have, God forbid, this is going to be a horrible example to use, but this is the one that's going to hit it home. God forbid, you have a child who does a shooting at a school. Do you think the parents should be liable? Should be held criminally liable, like arrested and charged with crimes based on the conduct of their child? No, that's not how this particular law works. Let me give you this example. Employees, employers. Right? Bartender at a bar serves an underage individual. Who gets charged? The bartender and the owner of the bar, even though the owner of the bar didn't do it. There's a special relationship there. If an employee commits a crime, especially on behalf of his employer, but the employer doesn't have to know, the employer doesn't have to direct, hey, commit this crime. But if the employee is acting on behalf of or to the benefit of, then the employer can be held vicariously liable. Is that fair? Like they could be charged with a crime? How about, guys familiar, this might be an old case, but Napster. There was a internet file sharing, swapping service on the internet. And the point is the individual who created Napster, which allowed people to share audio files, music files, and songs. And the music industry rallied. Ultimately, the owner of the platform was charged with copyright infringement charges. You never see those things at the beginning of a movie. Do not copy this. You can be charged by the feds. He was charged, and his defense was, I'm not doing anything wrong. I created this file swapping service. You could do anything with it. I'm not the one who's sharing music back and forth. But the argument was, but you gave the platform, and that was the intent of the platform. That's what the platform was being used for. It wasn't used for anything else except to share copyrighted material, music material. So he was charged based on all the users using it. The reality is you couldn't go after 1 million different unknown users. You needed somebody, you need the key guy and take it down. So those are examples of vicarious liability. We are done talking about states of mind and mens rea. We will talk about it when we talk about specific offenses, though, because you need it in every single crime, except with those limited exceptions I told you about. And now we'll move on to concurrence.